Okay, when you picture King Henry VIII, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it that larger-than-life, six wives, hot-tempered monarch? Or do you think of the young, handsome, athletic prince who is basically the hope of all England? Well, here's the thing. They were the exact same guy. Today, we're diving into the pretty shocking transformation of one of history's most famous and infamous kings.
Right, let's just get straight into it, because this contrast is absolutely staggering. On one side, you've got the young prince. People at the time called him an Adonis. He's over 6 feet tall, a jousting champion, lean, with a 32-inch waist. And on the other side, that's the king he became. Morbidly obese, weighing over 300 pounds, with a 52-inch waist. So huge, he actually needed hoists to get around. And his personality soured just as bad, going from this charismatic leader to a cruel, unpredictable tyrant.
So, that's the big question here, isn't it? How on earth does that happen? How does this golden boy, this figure of so much promise, turn into the monster we all remember from the history books? Well, the answer is a wild story of ambition, pain, and absolute power.
To really get the story of his downfall, we have to start at the very beginning, with a young king who was obsessed with one thing more than anything else, making sure his family line, the Tudors, would continue to rule.
You know, when Henry VIII became king at just 18 years old, he was the total package. I mean, he wasn't just good-looking and athletic. He was a real Renaissance man, a talented musician, a poet, and he was even a pretty serious scholar. He just charmed everyone and seemed to represent this bright new future for England.
But underneath all that glitter was this deep, gnawing anxiety. See, his father had actually won the throne in a war. The Tudor dynasty was new, it was fragile, and for Henry, having a son wasn't just something he wanted, it was an absolute political necessity to secure their power. But after 20 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, all they had was one daughter, Mary. In his mind, this was a full-blown crisis. It became known as the king's great matter.
So Henry didn't want a divorce. That was basically impossible to get back then. He wanted an annulment. And here's the key difference. An annulment says the marriage was never real in the first place, like it never legally happened. This would mean his daughter Mary was illegitimate, which would free him up to marry someone else and have a legitimate son.
So how did he try to argue this? He went straight to the Bible. See, Catherine had been married to his older brother, Arthur, for a hot minute before Arthur died. So Henry's whole case was based on a line from Leviticus that says, if you marry your brother's wife, you'll be childless. He took his lack of sons as a sign that God was punishing him. The problem? Catherine's side pointed to another book, Deuteronomy, which says a man should marry his brother's widow. This put the Pope in a completely impossible spot.
Well, when the Pope ultimately wouldn't give him the annulment, partly because he was being pressured by Catherine's super powerful nephew, Henry decided, fine, I'll do it myself. And his personal quest for a son was about to spark a revolution that would change England forever.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The catalyst wasn't just his need for an heir. It was his obsession with a new woman, Anne Boleyn. Anne was smart and she was ambitious. She flat out refused to be his mistress. She wanted to be the queen. So, fueled by this new passion, Henry made a move that nobody saw coming. If the Pope wouldn't help him, he'd just get rid of the Pope's power in his country.
And it happened unbelievably fast. In 1533, his own guy, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, grants the annulment. The very next year, the Act of Supremacy becomes law, declaring that Henry, not the Pope, was the head of the Church of England. And by 1536, he started tearing down the monasteries, grabbing all their land and money for himself. In just a few years, he had upended 1,000 years of religious tradition, all to get what he wanted. This radical break from Rome set the stage for one of the most infamous marital roller coasters in history, summed up perfectly by this little rhyme that British school kids have been learning for centuries. And this table really lays out the whole tragic saga. I mean, look at this. 24 years with Catherine of Aragon. His next 5 marriages barely lasted a decade combined. Anne Boleyn, the woman he tore his country apart for, she gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, and then he had her beheaded. Jane Seymour finally gave him his son, Edward, but she died right after. The marriage to Anne of Cleves lasted 6 months, then Catherine Howard, his teenage wife, beheaded. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, the one who actually managed to outlive him.
The birth of his son, Edward, should have been Henry's greatest moment. His dynasty was finally secure, but he was immediately followed by tragedy when Jane Seymour died just 12 days later. And by all accounts, Henry was absolutely devastated. Of all his wives, she was the one he requested to be buried next to, a rare glimpse of genuine grief that shows you the man he could have been. But a much, much darker turning point was right around the corner.
A lot of historians point to one single event that really sped up Henry's change from this powerful king into a total monster. And it wasn't a battle or a political betrayal. It was a horrible physical accident. Just look at this timeline. In 1536, the same year he executed Anne Boleyn and married Jane Seymour, Henry had this life-altering jousting accident. He was never, ever the same. This one moment, this is the pivot point for his whole life and his reign.
So get this, his horse, which was also wearing full armor, fell on top of him. He was knocked out cold for 2 hours. The accident also burst a varicose ulcer on his leg, and that wound, it never healed. For the rest of his life, it would get infected, it would fester, and it left him in constant, agonizing pain.
Remember this guy, the athlete with the 32-inch waist who loved hunting and jousting? Well, that life was over. Dot.
He couldn't exercise anymore, but he kept eating these massive feasts, and his body just ballooned. His waistline exploded to 52 inches. Now, chronic pain can change anybody's personality, right? But for a king with absolute power, it turned his already suspicious nature into full-blown tyranny.
And this isn't just us looking back and guessing. People saw it happening at the time. In 1541, the French ambassador wrote that people thought the king might actually die, not from a sickness, but from his leg. That pain and those infections were a constant threat, and it just fed his rage and his paranoia.
So when Henry finally died in 1547 at just 55 years old, what was his legacy? Well, it's just as complicated and contradictory as the man himself. On the one hand, you could say he was a nation builder. He strengthened the government, he brought Wales fully into the kingdom, and he's often called the father of the Royal Navy. But on the other hand, he executed tens of thousands of people, including 2 of his own wives. He left England totally divided over religion, a fight that would last for centuries, and he left the country bankrupt after burning through all the money his dad had saved. But you can't deny some of his achievements were huge. I mean, this chart really drives it home. He inherited a navy of just 5 ships. By the time he died, he had built this army by sea of over 50 ships, including massive warships. He basically laid the foundation for Britain to become a global naval power. So yeah, his reign was a study in extremes. He left his kingdom poor and divided. But the ripple effects of his actions, especially that break with Rome, set England on a completely new path. By cutting ties with the Pope, he wasn't just getting a new wife. He accidentally created a new kind of country, one where the king's power was greater than the church's. His personal desires completely redrew the map of power in Europe. Which really leaves us with this final question. What was he? A paranoid monster twisted by power and pain? An accidental modernizer who dragged his country into a new age? Or was he, at the end of the day, just a man ruled by some very human and very destructive desires for a son and a legacy? You know, maybe the real answer is that he was all 3.